The original Mustangs came out with Allison engines. They were extremely good for low-level work, and that's what the British used them for. Low-level fighter sweeps, tactical recon. They were unsuited for long-range escort work because the engine could not perform adequately at high altitude.
While the Mustang I did not have exceptional high-altitude performance, the British still loved the aircraft because down low, it was awesome. It was fast, it was quick, it could get away from anything. So they used it in a variety of roles, mainly low-altitude TAC recon and armed reconnaissance against ground targets. But sooner or later, they were bound to come in contact with the Luftwaffe, and in August of 1942, the first Mustang kill of the war was scored. And it's kind of an interesting incident because the fellow, Hollis Hills, was a Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who happened to be an American, flying an American aircraft in British service. And he shot down a Focke-Wulf 190. So it was one of those incidents of the war that truly reflected the international character of the Allied war effort.
Flying at treetop level and facing scores of light and medium flak batteries on every mission, the brave Mustang pilots pressed on, snapping photos of key installations and shooting up anything on the ground that moved. While the British found the Mustang very useful in Western Europe, at first the United States Army Air Force had little interest in the new fighter. It took some time before the Americans could be won over by the glowing reports coming back from the RAF on the Mustang's combat record. Almost reluctantly, the USAAF ordered a small number of Mustangs, dubbed the P-51A, and sent them to observation and tactical reconnaissance squadrons. Unfortunately, the Allison engine and its lack of a supercharger continued to limit the plane's high-level performance, a fact not lost upon the American pilots.
The very first P-51s were the A, had an Allison engine, and they were used for dive bombing and various things, but they were not very impressive.
I flew an A, a few hours in an A out of England, just practicing. We didn't have enough airplanes, and so I flew. We had a couple of A's on the field, and I flew that to practice some dive bombing, because it was basically a dive bomber. They didn't have the power, and they were just not as responsive. It had an Allison engine in it, and it really couldn't keep up with much of anything. As I said, it was primarily a dive bomber.
In late 1942, North American, utilizing some of the best features of the P-51A, unveiled a new version of the Mustang designed as a single-seat dive bomber and called it the A-36 Apache.
Only a couple hundred A-36s were produced, enough to equip a couple of fighter bomber groups, and those fighter bomber groups ended up serving in the Mediterranean or in Burma. The problem with the A-36 was it couldn't carry a heavy load, especially compared to the P-47, so it didn't last long in service. It was also vulnerable to ground fire, and in steep dives, the pilots had a tendency to torque the tail section and actually do structural damage in steep dives. So it was not particularly effective as a combat dive bomber, but what it did do was deliver ordnance with pinpoint accuracy far above and beyond anything that the other fighter bombers the Army Air Force had at the time.
Coming in at medium altitude, the Apache squadrons would line up on their targets, then wing over into steep dives, opening their butterfly flaps as they went to slow their descent. Using their reflector gun sights to aim, the pilots would wait until the very last possible moment to drop their bombs. At about 1,000 feet, they would pull up and come off target. Such hair-raising dives took nerves of steel and excellent marksmanship. But when done right, no other Army Air Force aircraft could get its bombs on target with better accuracy. And since it had derived from a fighter, the A-36 could fight its way out of trouble. In fact, Apache pilots scored many air-to-air victories, and at least one even became an ace. While the A-36 enjoyed limited success, dive bombing never really gained acceptance in an Army Air Force dominated by strategic bombing advocates. After serving for about a year, the dive bomber groups were all re-equipped and given fighters. In the A-36, the Mustang had reached an evolutionary dead end. But just when it looked like it would barely be a footnote to the European air campaign, a few inventive minds rescued North Americans' design and gave it a new lease on life. By mid-1943, the Mustang had seen combat as a reconnaissance aircraft, a dive bomber, and a ground attack fighter. As a pure fighter, however, it seemed destined to be a failure. But just as it appeared the Mustang would be relegated to minor roles in the air war, a few men came up with a brilliant idea that would transform the P-51 into the most effective air superiority fighter history has ever seen.
There was a British pilot by the name of Harker who got the idea of taking a Mustang 1 airframe and mating it with a British Merlin engine. And he proposed this to a U.S. Air Force, Army Air Force colonel by the name of Hitchcock, who agreed that this might be a worthy thing to do. So they went off and they got approval for this, and they took a Merlin engine, put it into a Mustang, and discovered that they had a thoroughbred fighter with excellent high-altitude capability. The Merlin was being produced in the United States at the time by Packard. And so pretty soon the approval was given to produce the Mustang with the Packard-built Merlin engine. And that became the P-51B, the first true strategic fighter of World War II.
The British engine that Packard built was extremely reliable. It was a great engine, lots of power, and altitude performance. Had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that let it get to high altitude. So it was a superior performer in every way.
With a top speed of almost 450 miles per hour at high altitude, the Merlin-powered Mustang now had the engine needed to carry the fight to the Luftwaffe as an air-to-air fighter. British and German fighters generally had an endurance of about 2 to 3 hours, which meant their combat radius was somewhere around 300 miles. With additional long-range drop tanks, the Mustangs soon proved they could fly for up to 8 hours. That meant the P-51 could range over the farthest reaches of Nazi Germany and still return to bases in England. The United States Army Air Force had its first strategic fighter, and it appeared on the scene none too soon. Through the fall of 1943, the heavy bombers of America's 8th Air Force had been taking a beating over Germany. Without escort fighters, the 8th's B-17s and B-24s were being shot to pieces by the Luftwaffe. Their bomber generals had begun screaming for a new fighter that could stay with their groups all the way to Berlin and back. It seemed a tall order, but the new P-51B fit the bill perfectly.
In the early part of the war, before the Mustangs came in, they couldn't get escort beyond a certain point. The 47s and 38s could only take them part way, and then they had to go back.